Before we deploy our first virtual machine, let's talk about virtual machine hardware versions. Specifically, what they call virtual machine compatibility. Compatibility and hardware versioning. How it works is that higher levels of virtual machine compatibility or virtual machine hardware versions provide more functionality. It's that simple. Each new version of vSphere offers a new hardware version, and you want to make sure that your virtual machines are kept compatible with the latest version of VMware vSphere that you're using in your environment. Now, of course, the latest version of vSphere can still run virtual machines that are using older versions of virtual machine hardware, but you just won't get the full functionality of the latest version of vSphere. But you just won't get the full functionality of vSphere 7 when it comes to specific virtual machine hardware features. Now, VMware Knowledge Base 1003746 lists out all of the virtual machine hardware versions, and I'll show you another page in the VMware documentation that compares every version of VMware virtual machine hardware, and in this matrix, it will show you the new features of each of the newer versions of virtual machine hardware. If we look at this knowledge base article first, covering the virtual machine hardware versions, you can see here how each of the different virtual machine hardware versions match up with specific versions of VMware vSphere or ESXi, or even specific versions of VMware Workstation or VMware Fusion. If we scroll up to the top, some of you who are astutely watching might notice that we've just been talking about VMware hardware version 17 that's new in vSphere 7, but this knowledge base article lists VMware hardware version 18, which is new in VMware vSphere 7 Update 1. We will be updating to U1 later in the course, which is why I haven't specifically mentioned the new hardware version 18 yet. But if we go to the VMware documentation and take a look at the hardware features availability with virtual machine compatibility settings documentation page, it does cover hardware version 18 here. And I apologize if this is a little difficult to read. It is relatively small for me as well, which is why I'll include the URL in the course notes. But this compares all the different virtual machine hardware versions and exactly what features are available as you move up to newer versions of the virtual machine hardware. Speaking of new features in the latest virtual machine hardware, let's talk about what's new in hardware version 17. With vSphere 7, we gain new virtual machine hardware version 17 and some additional new features. So what's new? Well, I want to be totally honest with you, as I do in all of these courses, and say, honestly, virtual machine hardware version 17 doesn't provide a lot of new exciting features. However, virtual machine hardware version 18, which is available in vSphere 7 Update 1, does have some impressive new features, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, what's new in virtual machine hardware 17 is USB 3.1 Super Speed Plus support, and this is exactly what it sounds like. It's a much faster version of USB. So if you have devices that support USB 3.1 Super Speed Plus, your virtual machines can now access those devices at the same high rate of speed. There's also support for maximum 3D graphics memory, now at 4 gigabytes. Previously, this was 2 gigabytes in vSphere 6.7. There's support for dynamic direct path, which we'll talk about later in this module. It's the ability for multiple virtual machines to share PCIe devices, and for VMware's distributed resource scheduler to know which device is on which host and ensure that virtual machines, when moved from host to host, have access to the PCI devices that they're assigned. Hardware version 17 supports precision clock devices. This uses PTP, or the Precision Time Protocol, and it's a super accurate way to synchronize time, much more accurate than the Network Time Protocol. However, precision clock devices do require specialized hardware, and for that reason, they're not typically used. VMware, in fact, still recommends NTP be configured inside the guest operating systems instead of choosing to utilize precision clock devices. There's also support for the Virtual Watchdog Timer. This is a new virtual device that can be added, but it's primarily used when you have clustered applications so that developers can know if virtual machine operating systems are alive and functioning when running inside the virtual machine. There's also support for virtual SGX devices. SGX stands for the Intel Software Guard Extensions, and these provide additional security benefits to your applications. However, SGX is also a processor-specific technology from Intel, so your ESXi host must support SGX in the CPUs of the physical hosts. You also have to ensure that you've enabled SGX in the BIOS on each one of your hosts in order to leverage SGX devices in your virtual machines. And then finally, support for Direct3D 10.1 for higher performance graphics. So that's what's new in virtual machine hardware version 17. But what about hardware version 18? Again, hardware version 18 is available when we upgrade to vSphere 7 Update 1. And there are some very impressive new maximum configurations with hardware version 18. For example, maximum memory in a virtual machine can now be configured up to 24,000 gigabytes, which is, yes, 24 terabytes in a virtual machine. That's incredible. The maximum number of logical processors in a virtual machine is now 768. That is also incredible. Maximum video memory for a virtual machine is now 256 megabytes. Maximum 3D graphics memory is now 8 megabytes. And there are a few other miscellaneous features. But with hardware version 18, it's really these incredible maximum configurations that can now be placed on a virtual machine if you're using vSphere 7 Update 1. For new vSphere admins, accessing the console of a virtual machine can initially be a little confusing. There are a couple of different ways to go about it, and there's a couple of different hotkeys or key combinations that you should be aware of. And if you don't know the right key combination, it's easy to get your mouse and keyboard stuck inside the virtual machine console and seemingly not be able to escape. Here in the vSphere client, if we go to a virtual machine, for example, this Active Directory domain controller running Windows Server, you notice here below the guest operating system tile, which, by the way, doesn't always refresh until you go into it and then go back, click off and back on. There we go. You can see below that tile, you've got really two options here to access this virtual machine console. You can launch the remote console, which is known as the VMRC, which stands for VMware Remote Console, or you can launch the web console. The web console will open up a new browser tab, just like this, whereas the VMRC will open up a separate application to access the console of this virtual machine. And if you click on the little eye here, it tells you that you need to download the VMRC or the VMware Remote Console in order to use this option to launch the remote console. So if we click on that, download VMRC, you can download this for free from VMware.com. Notice it has a version and release date, and periodically this is updated. So this would be an application that you would need to periodically update. And you can see here that it comes in 3 different flavors, one for Windows, one for Mac, and one for Linux. Now, to install this, it's super easy, just like installing any other Windows or Mac application. Honestly, I don't know that I've ever had the need to install it in Linux, but with Windows and Mac, you simply click through the traditional installer, next, 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 finish, and ta-da, you have the VMRC installed. So I'm not going to go through that process. I assure you it is quick and easy. You can see here by the file size, it's very small, 88 megs and 22 megabytes on Mac OS. Now, I've already installed the VMRC, and so when I click on Launch Remote Console, you can see a new application is opened up here called VMware Remote Console. We can maximize that, You can see here how this opens up the console for this guest operating system in a new application called VMware Remote Console. And if we go back to the vSphere client, a new tab has been opened to accomplish this that you can easily close. And those are the two different options for accessing this virtual machine's guest operating system console. And I do recommend the VMRC as it's a more reliable and full-featured application just dedicated to accessing and controlling guest operating system consoles. So in my opinion, it is worth taking the extra time to install the VMRC application. However, in a pinch, the web console works just fine. And you can see here we have options to enforce US keyboard layout. We can view full screen, use escape to exit full screen, and we can send Control-Alt-Delete to the guest operating system, which of course in a Windows environment is very useful because if you are on a Windows host and you push Control-Alt-Delete, you're going to send Control-Alt-Delete to the host operating system instead of to the guest operating system, which is what we're trying to do here. Now, this virtual machine does have the VMware tools installed. You can see that right here. The VMware tools are up and running. I'll show you later in this module exactly how to install the VMware tools. But what's important to know about the VMware tools is that they include drivers that will synchronize your mouse and keyboard with any remote console that you're using. So if I click on the console for this virtual machine, you notice my mouse can freely move back and forth from inside the virtual machine guest back to the host and then back to the guest. And if I use my keyboard, the keyboard works fine in the guest, and it also works fine back here on the host. If you don't have the VMware tools installed, it's easy to get your mouse stuck inside this guest console. And if we go to the VMRC, you can see here at the top, when I move my mouse inside the guest console, it says to release your mouse, press Control-Command, which on the Mac keyboard is formerly known as the Apple key. Now, if we were on a Windows machine running the VMRC, the command sequence would be Control-Alt to release our mouse out of the guest console. So again, Control-Alt on Windows and Control-Command in the Mac OS operating system. Another important hotkey here is Control-Option-Delete, which will actually send a Control-Alt-Delete to a Windows guest operating system on a Mac. And by the way, the equivalent keyboard command in Windows to send a Control-Alt-Delete is Control-Alt-Insert. You can also do things here like enter full screen mode, which in Mac OS is Control-Command-F, just like that. And then exit full screen mode, again with Control-Command-F. In Windows, the equivalent is Control-Alt-Enter. So those are the two different options you have for controlling a virtual machine console. The VMware Remote Console, or VMRC, which is a separate application for Windows, Mac, or Linux operating systems, or the built-in web console, which you use to control a virtual machine in your web browser. I recommend the VMRC. It does have more functionality and it does seem more stable. And also keep in mind, you can always control virtual machines running in vSphere with VMware Fusion and VMware Workstation. As they say, let the fun begin. It's time to create our first virtual machine. If you haven't done this before, I hope that you'll follow along with me in any sort of lab environment that you might have access to. It's super easy to create your first virtual machine. To get started, we're going to go over into the vSphere client. We'll be creating our first virtual machine here in the prod cluster. I'm going to right click and click Create New Virtual Machine. And this brings up the new virtual machine wizard. It's going to walk us through the process. The first thing we need to do is to select a creation type. How would we like to create this virtual machine? Well, the default is to create a brand new virtual machine from scratch. We have a number of other options here, such as deploying from a template, cloning an existing virtual machine, cloning a virtual machine to a template, cloning a template to a template, or converting a template to a virtual machine. And these are all other creation types that we'll be exploring in this course. But in our case, we're going to take the default and create a brand new virtual machine. And then the most obvious question comes up, well, what do you want to call this virtual machine? And if this is your very first virtual machine, by all means, take the default. You can call it new virtual machine. You can call it Bob, Sally, whatever you want to call it. That's great. But in production environments, I would encourage you to start using some sort of naming convention. So it might be something like web for web server, win for Windows, and one for some sort of sequence number. If you're going to have multiple Windows web servers, this would very easily allow you to identify which web server you're talking about and what operating system that web server is running. Maybe you have Windows web servers and you have Linux web servers, and you want to be able to differentiate those. Maybe you have SQL servers and web servers that make up a multi-tiered application. So you name the web servers web and the SQL database servers SQL or SQL. The next question here is, where shall we place this virtual machine in the inventory? And the default is going to be your virtual data center. We'll take that default as well. Here at the Wired Brain Coffee Company, their virtual data center is in Hilton Head, South Carolina. The next question is, which compute resource will you be running this virtual machine on? If you just have a single ESXi host, you'll see that listed here. But in our case, we have created clusters. And inside those clusters, we have ESXi hosts, which we called nodes, node 0 through 3. And since we haven't yet enabled what's called Distributed Resource Scheduler, or DRS, we can't select an individual cluster and allow the virtual machine to be automatically placed with DRS auto placement. We have to select an individual host in this case. But later in the course, you'll learn about DRS and automatic placement, and we'll be able to select a vSphere cluster, and then that virtual machine will simply be automatically placed on the host that has the most resources available for it. So we'll select node 1 and click next. The next question is, where would you like to store this virtual machine's disk file? In our case, thanks to our vSphere 7 storage course, we have a number of different storage options out here. We have an iSCSI SAN, we have an NFS NAS, and we have VMware vSAN. Let's go ahead and store this virtual machine on our vSAN data store, which has plenty of free space available. We'll click next. And now we're asked about compatibility. And I know earlier we talked about virtual machine hardware versions. Well, each one of these different compatibility levels matches up with a different VMware virtual machine hardware compatibility version. In our case, the default is going to be hardware version 17, which is ESXi version 7.0 or later. If you had some need to create a virtual machine with a previous hardware version for backward compatibility to older versions of VMware vSphere, this would be the place that you would do it. We'll click next. And now we're asked to select the type of guest operating system and guest operating system version that will be installed inside this guest VM. The guest OS families are simply Windows, Linux, or other, with other being a wide variety of different operating systems, including Mac OS X, by the way, which only runs on a host that's using Apple hardware, IBM OS 2, yes, Novell NetWare, Solaris, and even VMware ESXi. Yes, you can install ESXi in a virtual machine that runs on top of ESXi. But in our case, we'll be using Windows operating systems, and specifically, you can see there's a long list here that goes all the way back to Microsoft MS-DOS, Windows 3.1, Windows 95, Windows NT. Some of you may remember those, but our operating system will be the latest and greatest, Windows Server 2019. We'll click next here. And now we're prompted to customize our hardware. And this is something that we'll get into later in this course. I don't want to go into this right now. So let's go ahead and click next. And then we get a final chance to review what we're about to do. We'll click finish. And if we check our recent tasks, you can see The creation process has completed successfully. You can see the new virtual machine is created here, WebWin1, and it's currently powered off. So that's how easy it is to create your first virtual machine in vSphere. In an upcoming lesson, we'll be installing a guest operating system inside of this new virtual machine. I'll show you how to configure the virtual machine hardware and more. Before we install our guest operating system, I want to talk for just a moment about configuring and managing virtual machine templates. You can think of templates just like a cookie cutter. When you go to make cookies, every cookie you cut out with that cutter will look just like the original. And virtual machine templates work the same way. You can create a virtual machine template, and then every new virtual machine that you create from the template will be almost identical to the template. Here in the vSphere client, if I were to right-click and say New Virtual Machine, I can deploy a virtual machine from a template and then select a template from either the content library or from our vSphere virtual inventory. From there, I would select where I want to store the new virtual machine, where I want to run it, review the details, and boom, that new virtual machine is created. I don't have to install an operating system, assuming the original template had one, and I don't have to answer a lot of other questions about specifically how I want this virtual machine configured. Templates are the fastest way to create new virtual machines, and for that reason, we'll be spending a fair amount of time in this module on exactly how to create a virtual machine from a template. And of course, I'll show you how easy it is to create a template from a virtual machine by using cloning. Stay tuned for more goodness around using virtual machine templates. You may be wondering exactly where to place new virtual machines, hosts, clusters, and resource pools in the vSphere inventory. And this is a very logical question for any new vSphere administrator. You create a new VM, and most likely, in the most simplest scenario, you'll place that virtual machine onto the ESXi host that it's running on. But where in the inventory is that ESXi host? And what are the different ways to view these types of objects? Here in the vSphere client, we created our virtual machine, and that new virtual machine is actually placed on top of the cluster in this case. But that's only because we have this concept of a cluster already created. This virtual machine is actually running, or will be running, I should say, on node 1, which you can see right here on the right, which is part of cluster prod 1. However, if we didn't have a cluster, that ESXi host, node 1, would simply be underneath our virtual data center, which in this case is named Hilton Head, South Carolina. I do like to name virtual data centers based on the location of the virtual data center because vCenter is used to manage multiple virtual data centers. Now, you could have multiple virtual data centers at the same physical location, and that is completely okay as well. I also recommend some sort of naming convention for the virtual data centers, for the vCenter server, for the clusters, for the nodes, and as we talked about earlier, for the virtual machines. Now, there are a few different ways to view objects in the vSphere web client. Right now, we're in the hosts and clusters inventory, which, as you can tell, shows vCenter servers, followed by virtual data centers, followed by clusters or ESXi hosts, and then virtual machines. Now, you can add, as you can see here, other types of objects, such as folders, or resource pools, depending which level of the inventory you're at. You can also move from the hosts and clusters inventory into the virtual machines and templates inventory. So this lists all of our virtual machines and templates, which we'll be working with later in the course. And then, of course, there's also the storage inventory, which we worked with during our storage course, and the networking inventory. We'll talk more about organizing this inventory later in the course. At this point, we've created our first virtual machine, and it's now time to deploy a guest operating system into that VM. There are a number of different ways to obtain guest operating systems. The requirement is going to be that you need an ISO image file. That ISO image file represents an optical disk, and it could be very small or it could be multiple gigabytes, maybe 5, 6 gigabytes. You can obtain these ISO image files either open source out on the internet for Linux disk images, or as trial images, for example, from Microsoft for Windows Server and Windows 10. In our case, I've downloaded a trial of Windows Server 2019 and I have an ISO image file. If we go here to the vSphere client, we've selected the virtual machine that we've just created. If we right click and go into edit the settings for this virtual machine, what we need to do is to install this ISO image as if we're inserting an optical disk into this virtual machine. So just as you would have a physical server in the data center with traditionally an optical CD or DVD drive, you would put the installation media into that drive. We're going to go through the same process here, but everything is virtual. We've got a virtual machine with a virtual CD DVD drive. And since we don't have real disks here, we have a few different ways to mount that ISO image of the optical disk. We can use a client device, which means we're going to mount this device from the client, from this machine that I'm working on here. We could alternatively upload the ISO image to a data store on one of the ESXi hosts, or for example, the vSAN shared data store. Or we could create a content library and upload our ISO file there. We'll talk more about content libraries, and I'll show you how to upload data store ISO files in upcoming lessons. For now, we're going to use the client device option, but you can't connect a client device until the virtual machine is powered on. So we'll say cancel here because we didn't change anything. We'll go up to the top of this virtual machine and I'll click the power button. You can see the virtual machine is powering on. We could use the web console or we can use the VMRC. Let's go ahead and opt for the VMRC. And we're brought here into the VMRC where we are attempting to boot. However, we don't have any ISO images connected or mounted at this point. So that boot fails and we're brought here into the boot manager. So if I click on the screen, I can control this boot manager with my keyboard. However, if I try to get out, move my mouse, it looks like it's stuck. So do any of you recall the keyboard combination that we push to release our mouse from a virtual machine console where the VMware tools have yet to be installed? Well, I'll tell you the answer is Control-Alt, and our mouse is magically released. And then what we can do now is we can go up here to the virtual machine configuration, select the virtual CD drive. We'll click here to configure the CD SATA settings, and then use the drop-down here to select a local disk image. I'll go ahead and select the Windows Server 2019 ISO image that we've previously downloaded from the Microsoft website. I'll say OK there. And then you need to make sure that you connect this ISO image. Of course, any operating system that you're installing in your vSphere environment, you always want to make sure that you have either an open source license, a trial license, or a licensed version of that operating system. In this case, we're running a trial license of Windows Server 2019. I'll click back in the boot manager. I'll go up and I'll select the virtual CD-ROM drive. And then any of you who have installed Windows before have seen the message to press any key to boot from CD. And then, of course, loading files. Let's give this just a moment. And there we go. We see the familiar Windows Server 2019 screen, and it's here that we can start the installation process. I can tell you that my mouse is very jerky right now. It's kind of hard to control. It doesn't get stuck inside, but once the mouse is inside the console, the virtual mouse has trouble catching up with my physical mouse. So we'll click install here. And because this isn't a Windows Server installation course, we're not going to go through this whole Windows Server installation. This will take a few moments to complete. We'll select the desktop experience, accept the end user license, perform a custom installation. We'll take the default unallocated disk space and begin the installation. I'll pause the recording and I'll be back once the Windows installation has completed so I can show you exactly how our new Windows guest operating system is going to function running in a virtual machine. And with that, the installation of our new guest operating system has completed. If we click here in the window and on a Mac, hold down Option Control Delete, that's actually Control Alt Delete, or alternatively, you can go up here to the virtual machine tab and go down to click Send Control Alt Delete, which will accomplish the same thing. I'll go ahead and log in with the password that I configured during the installation, and we are now running Windows Server 2019 inside a guest operating system on top of VMware vSphere 7. If we go back to the vSphere client, you can see we have an updated tile image of the guest operating system. VMware knows which guest operating system is inside this virtual machine. After all, we configured that when we deployed the virtual machine. But we also have a warning message up on the top that says VMware Tools is not installed on this virtual machine. Click here to install. That's something we'll be doing very shortly in an upcoming lesson. But for now, it's great to have our first virtual machine created here in the Wired Brain Coffee Company's virtual infrastructure, and our first guest operating system installed and running inside the brand new virtual machine. The great thing about virtual machines is when it comes to modifying hardware, it's all virtual hardware. So unlike a physical computer where you have to go purchase a new CPU and hope that you have room to add that CPU or add that additional memory or add that additional storage, with a virtual machine, it's all virtual hardware. And I'm not saying that you can just infinitely scale up the amount of hardware on a virtual machine, because there are limits, but those limits are really only constrained by the resources of your physical hosts. And in many cases, you can even overcommit the resources of your physical hosts, meaning you can assign more memory to a virtual machine than the host actually has to provide that virtual machine. If we go into the vSphere client, there are a couple of different ways to edit the settings of a virtual machine. I can right click on the virtual machine here and go into Edit Settings, or I can go up to the icons on the top of the virtual machine here and click Edit Settings. And then finally, one more, I can go to the Actions and I can access the same list that you saw over here when I right clicked on the virtual machine. And of course, I can go in here and edit the settings for this virtual machine as well. Now, what you'll see is that there's a number of virtual machine settings that are grayed out. And that's because this virtual machine is powered on, it's running. So for example, it won't let me change the amount of memory or the amount of CPU available to this virtual machine right now, because again, the virtual machine is running, but I should be able to hot add CPU and memory if the VMware tools are installed and if your guest operating system supports it. We'll talk about that more later in the course, but you can see that a number of settings are available here. For example, I could increase the size of this virtual machine disk on the fly. I could simply edit the size of that virtual machine disk, click OK, and that virtual machine disk would be resized. Now, that's not something we're going to do right now, so I'm going to go ahead and change that back. But the point is here that you can modify virtual machine hardware. You can even add new devices. For example, I could add a second hard disk on this virtual machine. I could add another network interface card right down here under network adapters. I could move the virtual network that this virtual adapter is connected to, and much more, all while the virtual machine is running. Now, in some cases, the virtual machine will need to be powered off to make configuration changes to the virtual hardware. But you can see how easy it is to simply click Edit Settings on a virtual machine to reconfigure virtual hardware on the fly. We have a virtual machine with a guest operating system deployed, but every guest operating system running inside a virtual machine in vSphere needs to have the VMware tools installed. And that's for a variety of different reasons. The VMware tools install drivers for things like memory ballooning, graphic performance, network performance, application aware snapshots, and yes, the synchronization of your mouse and keyboard. Here in the vSphere client, to install the VMware tools, of course, we have a big red message up here that tells us to do it. However, if you don't see that, there's a number of different ways to get the VMware tools installed. You can go to the Actions menu, down to Guest OS, and then over to Install VMware Tools here. This is also the same place you would upgrade the VMware tools. You can also, of course, right-click on the virtual machine, go to the same Guest OS option, and install the VMware tools here as well. So let's click on the option to install VMware tools, and it tells us that the VMware tools includes drivers to improve graphics, mouse, networking, and storage for virtual VMware devices. Once we click Mount here, a virtual CD/DVD disk image will be mounted in the Guest OS, and then we'll need to go into the Guest OS and install the VMware Tools application. With the VMware Tools mounted, we'll click on the Guest OS console, and of course you can use the VMRC or you can use the web-based console like we're in here. If we close out the server manager, and in many cases you'll see this message right here that says the DVD drive VMware Tools has been mounted. What would you like to do with it? We'll click to run the setup, and then this is a traditional Windows installation. You have options here to do the typical, complete, or custom installs. 99% of the time, you will take just the typical installation. Click Install. This will take a moment. You can see a number of drivers are being installed. And I should note that the VMware tools are operating system specific. So there are VMware tools for Linux operating systems, Windows, and more. I'll click Finish. And then you do need to restart the guest operating system for the VMware tools drivers to take effect. Once the reboot has completed, if we go back to the VMware client, do a little refresh here, click off, click back on, and you can see now the VMware tools are running and they are current. The current version is installed. Of course, to upgrade the VMware tools, you can right-click and go into Guest OS. However, our VMware tools are current, so the upgrade isn't available. So that's how easy it is to install the VMware tools. The second item on our list I want to mention is how to upgrade your VMware virtual machine hardware. Notice that the hardware for this virtual machine, if we scroll on down, it says compatibility is ESXi version 7 or later, virtual machine hardware version 17. Now we're already at the latest version of VMware hardware, so we can't upgrade this virtual machine. But let's say that we created a brand new virtual machine just for the purposes of demonstrating how to upgrade the VMware hardware. So we'll select a node. We'll just click through this very quickly. But when we get to the compatibility, let's go ahead and change this down. And for example, set this at ESX version 6.0 or later, which is virtual machine hardware version 11. And it tells us that some virtual machine hardware features are unavailable with this option. And it's the same thing if you select any other version. It gives you a warning that, hey, some new features are not going to be available. Let's leave it at 6.0, hardware version 11. I'll click Finish, Next, Next, and Finish. We'll give this a moment to complete. And it didn't take very long. We have a new virtual machine. If we scroll down, you can see the compatibility is ESX Server 6.0 and later, virtual machine hardware version 11. Now, if we were to right click on this virtual machine, we can go to the compatibility, and it's here that we can upgrade the virtual machine compatibility. We'll click yes, and then we can choose which compatibility level we desire. In this case, we want to upgrade to the latest and greatest. I'll say okay. And there we go. It's that easy. Compatibility has been changed to virtual machine hardware version 17, the latest and greatest with vSphere 7. And with that, of course, you get additional features and functionality that are related to vSphere 7. So that's how easy it is to upgrade your virtual machine hardware. We're going to go ahead and remove this virtual machine for now and move on to talk about some more virtual machine configuration. We've talked about how our virtual machines have virtual hardware that maps back to real physical hardware. Well, there's a certain type of physical hardware that virtual machines can access that you might not have thought about, and that is PCI devices. So it is possible for a virtual machine to access a PCI device. Think about a dedicated network adapter on an ESXi host and have full hardware-based access to that PCI device. VMware calls this PCI pass-through, and they've branded it Direct I/O. Now, I'll be honest, I don't commonly see this used, but it is in the VCP certification exam blueprint, and it is something that I think that you should be aware of. And you really start this configuration over on specific hosts that have PCI devices that you want to make accessible to your virtual machines. For example, if we go here to the configuration tab on an ESXi host, and then down to hardware and PCI devices, it's here that you would look at all PCI devices on this host, find the device that you want to allow PCI pass-through on, and then click Configure Pass-Through. You would find the device and then make your selection. But of course, you need to be careful here because you don't want to pull a device away from, for example, a vSwitch, especially if it's in use. So select your device carefully. We'll check the status of this. We have refreshed the PCI pass-through device information there. And then we do have, indeed, a PCI pass-through enabled device on this host. With that configured, you would go to the virtual machine where you want to configure Direct I/O to be able to access this pass-through device. You'd need to make sure that that virtual machine was powered off. And once powered off, you could go in and edit the settings for the virtual machine, add a new device, go down and find PCI device. Notice that it gives us a warning here that full memory reservation will be applied automatically. It's required whenever you add PCI devices. Scroll down and then select your Direct Path I/O device. And in our case, we only have one because we only assigned PCI pass-through on a single device, and you could click OK. Now, before I do that, I want to point out that one of the cool new features of vSphere 7 is that virtual machines can now specify PCI pass-through devices by their vendor and model names. That is new. vSphere Distributed Resource Scheduler also uses those names to identify the host containing all specified devices available for pass-through, and DRS can recognize whether PCI devices are in use by another virtual machine, assigning only the available devices. So there's a number of new updates related to PCI pass-through with vSphere 7. It's important to know that there is kind of a higher level, if you will, of Direct Path I/O, and that's where you can utilize what they call dynamic Direct Path I/O, where you can actually assign multiple PCI pass-through devices to a virtual machine, and then vSphere Distributed Resource Scheduler can identify a host within a cluster that has available devices that match the vendor name and model. And then finally, there's the NVIDIA Grid vGPU PCI device option. This is where if an ESXi host has an NVIDIA Grid graphical processing unit or GPU, you can actually configure a virtual machine to leverage these virtual graphical processing units. In our case, we'll take the standard Direct Path I/O option and click OK. If we check our recent task, you can see that the virtual machine has been reconfigured. And with that, our virtual machine will now have access directly to the full PCI device on this ESXi host, and it will be dedicated with full hardware performance to this virtual machine. It's important to ensure that any operating systems running in your data center have the correct date and time. And that's why time synchronization these days has become just so critical. Time synchronization is critical for security certificates to work, for logging to be accurate, troubleshooting to be accurate, troubleshooting to be possible, and more. Now, it is possible to use the VMware tools to synchronize the time between the guest operating systems and the hosts, in this case, ESXi server, in this case, VMware vSphere. However, the best practices dictate that you probably should not do that. If we go to the vSphere client and look at our virtual machine, we could launch the VMRC, and here in this Windows server, you can enable, in fact, it's on by default, automatic time and date configuration. Set time automatically is on such that this Windows server will contact time servers out on the internet to find out the exact date and time. I do, of course, recommend that you set the time zone on your guest virtual machines to ensure that the time zone is always accurate and isn't changing. Adjust for daylight savings time is also a nice feature, but for the most part, time synchronization on Windows guest virtual machines is enabled by default. Now, it is possible to go into the command line and go to VMware Tools and run the command VMware Toolbox CMD, checking the time sync status, which you can see is disabled by default. If you did enable this, that would allow the guest virtual machines to contact the ESXi hosts through VMware tools that they're running on and pull back the accurate date and time. However, according to VMware's documentation, the built-in NTP clients that you'll find in Windows and Linux are going to be much more accurate than the VMware tools built-in time synchronization. So what have we learned in this module? Well, we started off by learning how to identify capabilities of virtual machine hardware versions. Every new version of vSphere has an associated virtual machine hardware version, and with each new version, you receive additional capabilities. It's always important to keep your virtual machines updated unless you have some reason to keep them at a lower virtual machine hardware version. And of course, vSphere 7 has the new virtual machine hardware version 17. With hardware version 17, there aren't a lot of new CPU and memory configuration maximums that become available, but there are additional features such as the new USB 3.1 Super Speed Plus, Dynamic Direct Path I/O, Virtual Precision Clock Device, Virtual SGX devices, Direct3D 10.1, and more. From there, you learn the two different options available for accessing a virtual machine console, either the web console or the VMware remote console, known as VMRC. And then from there, you help the Wired Brain Coffee Company deploy their first virtual machine. You also learned how to configure virtual machine templates, where to place objects in the vSphere inventory, such as virtual machines, and then how to configure and deploy a guest operating system into the new virtual machine. We deployed Windows Server 2019, and then you learned how to configure and modify the virtual hardware for that virtual machine. After that, you saw how easy it was to configure virtual machine disk provisioning types between thin provisioned and thick provisioned. We also learned the benefits of thin provisioning over the traditional thick provisioning option. From there, you saw how to install the VMware tools and upgrade virtual machine hardware. You learned about configuring PCI pass-through and direct I/O. And then finally, best practices around configuring virtual machine time synchronization. I hope you enjoyed this module on creating and deploying virtual machines. We've got a lot more to cover. Stick with me for our next module on creating and deploying vApps.